There is a version of World War II that most people carry with them. It has clear borders, clear enemies, clear heroes. It has a beginning defined by aggression and an ending defined by liberation. It fits inside a sentence, inside a classroom lesson, inside a museum exhibit with arrows on the floor telling you which direction to walk. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is carefully arranged. It has been organized the same way that military bureaucracies organized everything during the war itself, with selective documentation, deliberate omission, and the institutional habit of recording what was sanctioned while quietly setting aside what was not. What follows is not a revision of the war. It is a reading of what was actually recorded, what was filed and then sealed, what was known by administrators and generals and government officials who signed their names to documents that were later classified, later destroyed, later quietly transferred to archives where they sat for decades before anyone was allowed to look. The war you think you know was real, but it was surrounded on all sides by a second war, one fought with paperwork, silence, and procedure, and that second war has never fully ended. The first thing that needs to be understood is how thoroughly the administrative machinery of World War II functioned. Not the weapons, not the tactics, the paperwork. Because the paperwork is where the reality lives. When historians describe the Holocaust, they often note that the German bureaucracy produced staggering quantities of documentation, transportation schedules, supply manifests, personnel records, requests for materials, budgetary allocations, departmental memos coordinating between agencies. What is less often noted is that this level of documentation was not unique to Germany. Every major military power in the war generated its own enormous archive of administrative records, and inside those records, if you know how to read them, you find the same pattern repeated across every nation that participated in the conflict. Violence was processed, suffering was categorized, decisions about who lived and who died were routed through approval chains and signed off by officials who were, in almost every measurable way, doing their jobs correctly. The horror of World War II was not primarily the product of monsters acting outside the system. It was the product of ordinary people acting precisely within it. The German state's approach to mass murder is the most documented example of this process, and it is worth describing in concrete terms because the abstraction of phrases like industrialized genocide obscures what actually happened at the operational level. The deportation of Jews from occupied territories was not managed by fanatics roaming the countryside. It was managed by railway administrators. The German national railway system, the Reichsbahn, transported millions of people to the eastern killing centers using ordinary scheduling protocols. The railway officials who coordinated these transports knew what they were transporting. They had to. Coordination with camp administrators required knowing arrival times, expected numbers, and what facilities would be needed on the receiving end. The railway charged per-kilometer rates for these transports. The same rates applied to any passenger movement, with a discounted group fare applied because the numbers were large. The billing was processed, the payments were recorded, the accounting departments filed the receipts. The men who managed this were not members of the SS. They were civil servants with professional titles and pension plans. Adolf Eichmann, who coordinated the logistics of Jewish deportations from across Europe, was not a particularly unusual bureaucrat in the context of his time. His trial in Jerusalem in 1961 produced a record that disturbed observers precisely because of what it revealed about the nature of his participation. He used the language of administration throughout. He described his work in terms of coordination problems and scheduling difficulties and the challenge of aligning multiple departmental timelines. When pressed on the moral dimension of what he had organized, he returned repeatedly to the framework of orders, chains of command, and the professional obligation to complete assigned tasks efficiently. This was not evasion, or rather, it was evasion, but it was evasion enabled by a system that had been specifically designed to allow it. The design was not accidental. When the final solution was being formalized in 1942, one of the deliberate choices made by its architects was to diffuse moral responsibility across as many institutional layers as possible, so that no individual at any level needed to understand themselves as making a decision to kill. The train conductor moved the train. The station master managed the schedule. The administrator processed the paperwork. The budget officer approved the expenditure. Each step was separated from the next by a layer of institutional distance, and each step, viewed in isolation, was entirely routine. This diffusion of responsibility was not unique to Germany. It was a structural feature of large-scale organized violence in the 20th century, and it appeared in every theater of the war. In Japan, the military and civilian administrative apparatus that oversaw the occupation of China and Southeast Asia operated through exactly the same mechanisms. The Unit 731 program, which conducted lethal medical experiments on prisoners in Manchuria, was a military operation with a budget, a chain of command, personnel evaluations, and departmental reports. The experiments were documented, the results were filed. The program had administrators who processed the paperwork for material requisitions without being required to physically witness what the materials were used for. When the war ended and American occupation authorities discovered Unit 731, the decision was made at the highest levels of the American military and government to suppress the evidence of the program's existence in exchange for the experimental data. This decision was also processed through paperwork. Memos were written, agreements were formalized. The scientists and administrators of Unit 731 were granted immunity from prosecution and allowed to continue their careers in Japanese medicine, academia, and industry. The records of the immunity agreement were classified. Some of them remained classified for decades. The immunity granted to Unit 731 personnel was not an anomaly in the post-war settlement. It was a pattern. The way wars end matters as much as the way they are fought, and the way World War II ended involved a systematic process of determining which crimes would be prosecuted, which would be overlooked, and which would be absorbed into the institutional apparatus of the victorious powers. The Nuremberg trials are remembered as a landmark in the history of international law, and they were. But Nuremberg prosecuted a specific selection of German officials and military commanders, chosen through a process that was itself deeply political. Many of the decisions made during that selection process were made on the basis of what evidence was available, what prosecutions were diplomatically convenient, and what the Soviet, British, American, and French governments were each willing to have examined in open court. There were crimes committed by the Allied powers during the war that no one at Nuremberg was going to discuss, because the prosecutors were also the defendants, and the institutional habit of selective documentation that had governed the war itself continued seamlessly into the process of judging it. One of the clearest examples of this selective accountability is the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The bombing of German cities and later Japanese cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945, carried out by British and American aircraft over 3 consecutive nights, killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people, the majority of them civilians, in a city that had limited strategic value at that late stage of the war. The bombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night, burning 16 square miles of residential and commercial districts. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed somewhere between 130,000 and 226,000 people, depending on how the deaths from radiation exposure in the following months are counted. These operations were planned, authorized, and executed through the same kind of careful institutional process that governed every other major military decision. Target selection committees met. Bomb loads were calculated. Weather reports were consulted. After-action reports were filed documenting the results. The people who planned and executed these operations were not operating outside the law as it existed at the time, because the law as it existed at the time had not yet established clear prohibitions against the deliberate targeting of civilian populations at the scale that air power made possible. The legal frameworks that might have governed these actions were written after the actions had already been taken, and they were written by the governments whose actions they would have needed to govern, which created a structural problem that has never been satisfactorily resolved. The question of what constitutes a war crime and who has the authority to prosecute it was one of the central unresolved questions of the 20th century, and World War II brought it into focus in a way that was never fully confronted. The Allied powers established the principle at Nuremberg that certain actions were criminal regardless of whether they had been ordered by legal authority, regardless of whether the perpetrators were following the laws of their own country, and regardless of whether those actions had been officially sanctioned by a functioning government. This was a genuinely significant legal development, but it was applied asymmetrically, and the asymmetry was not incidental. The Allied powers were not going to prosecute themselves. The Soviet Union, whose forces killed large numbers of German prisoners and civilians during the war, and whose NKVD had carried out systematic political murders throughout the conflict, sat on the tribunal that prosecuted Germans for similar actions. This was not a secret. It was simply accepted as the inevitable consequence of having a tribunal composed of the victorious powers, which is to say, the only parties with the institutional capacity to conduct such a tribunal in the first place. The treatment of German prisoners of war by the Soviet Union is one of the areas where the documentary record has only become accessible in the decades since the end of the Cold War. Approximately 3 million German soldiers were captured by Soviet forces during the war. Of these, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million died in captivity, from starvation, exposure, disease, and in some cases, direct execution. The conditions in Soviet POW camps were brutal by any measurable standard, and this was not the result of administrative failure or supply shortages that couldn't be helped. Documents that became available after the collapse of the Soviet Union show that food allocations for German prisoners were set at levels that guaranteed malnutrition over extended periods, and that the labor demands placed on prisoners in the Gulag system were calibrated to extract maximum economic value, regardless of the physical cost to the prisoners. This treatment violated the Geneva Convention, which the Soviet Union had signed. The violations were known to Soviet authorities because the conditions were the result of deliberate policy decisions. None of this was examined at Nuremberg. Soviet members of the tribunal participated in drafting the verdicts against German officials for mistreating prisoners of war. The treatment of Japanese Americans inside the United States during the war is another area where the institutional record is extensive and where the distance between official justification and actual reality is measurable in the documents. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced removal of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes on the West Coast and their confinement in internment camps for the duration of the war. The order was presented as a military necessity, a precautionary measure against potential espionage and sabotage. The documentary record tells a more complicated story. Internal government communications from the period show that senior officials in the War Department and the Department of Justice were aware that the evidence for systematic Japanese-American disloyalty was extremely thin. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, communicated to the Attorney General that his agency had already identified and arrested the small number of individuals who posed a genuine security risk, and that mass incarceration was not supported by the intelligence picture. These communications were not made public at the time. The Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutionality of the internment, Korematsu v. United States, was decided on the basis of military necessity arguments that the government's own internal documents showed were not fully supported by the evidence the government itself possessed. Those documents were withheld from the court. The case was not overturned until 2018. The internment program had a financial dimension that is less frequently discussed. When Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes, they were given extremely short notice to dispose of their property and possessions. Farms, businesses, homes, and personal property were sold under duress. often at a small fraction of their actual value, to buyers who were fully aware that the sellers had no choice and no time. The total economic loss to Japanese-American families from this forced liquidation has been estimated in the billions of dollars in present value. The government program that eventually provided reparations in 1988 paid each surviving internee $20,000, which did not come close to representing the actual financial damage, and which came 43 years after the war ended. The use of forced labor throughout the war extended far beyond the German concentration camp system, and the range of governments and corporations that participated in it is considerably wider than is commonly acknowledged. The German war economy was heavily dependent on forced labor drawn from occupied territories across Europe. By 1944, approximately 8 million foreign workers were performing labor in Germany under conditions that ranged from coercive to lethal, depending on the category the worker had been assigned to. Soviet, Polish, and Jewish workers occupied the most dangerous positions, with mortality rates that reflected deliberate policy decisions about which categories of labor were expendable. But the use of forced labor was not confined to Germany's enemies. The Japanese military's use of forced labor in occupied territories across Asia, including the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway using Allied prisoners of war and Asian civilian laborers, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 90,000 Asian laborers and 12,000 Allied POWs. These deaths are documented in contemporary Japanese military records and in the accounts of survivors. The railway line that was built with this labor was completed in 1943 and used for military supply operations for approximately 2 years before the Japanese military position in the region collapsed. What is less well known is the extent to which American and British corporations had pre-war relationships with German industrial concerns that continued in various forms into the early war years, and the extent to which those relationships shaped both the conduct of the war and the post-war settlement. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Exxon, had a cartel arrangement with IG Farben, the German chemical conglomerate that produced the Zyklon B used in the gas chambers and that operated a synthetic rubber plant using slave labor at Auschwitz. The arrangement involved the exchange of technical patents and the coordination of production in ways that, according to documents examined by congressional investigators after the war, may have contributed to American shortages of synthetic rubber at the beginning of the war. The congressional investigation produced a record, but Standard Oil paid a small fine, and the matter was essentially concluded without further consequence to the company or its executives. IG Farben was broken up after the war, but many of its constituent companies continued to operate under different names, and several of them became major corporations in post-war Germany. The relationship between the Allied intelligence services and former Nazi officials in the post-war period is one of the most extensively documented examples of institutional moral discontinuity in modern history, and it deserves to be described in some detail because the documentation is real and the consequences were significant. Operation Paperclip was the American program that brought German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists to the United States after the war. The program was formally authorized by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, and it involved the active suppression of information about the participants' wartime activities in order to qualify them for American security clearances. Wernher von Braun, who became one of the central figures in the American space program and whose work on the Saturn V rocket contributed to the Apollo moon landings, had been an SS officer and had overseen the use of slave labor from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp in the production of V-2 rockets during the war. Prisoners who worked in the underground V-2 production facility died at a higher rate than any other concentration camp labor program in Germany. Von Braun's SS membership and his knowledge of the conditions at the Dora facility were known to American intelligence officers who processed his case. His file was amended to remove this information before it was forwarded to the agency that would grant his security clearance. This was not done secretly in the sense of being hidden from everyone. It was done through an institutional process that involved multiple officials, all of whom understood what they were doing and why. The knowledge that the American intelligence community brought into its post-war operations through programs like Paperclip and through the recruitment of former German intelligence officers extended beyond technical expertise. Reinhard Gehlen, who had headed German military intelligence operations against the Soviet Union during the war, was recruited by American military intelligence at the war's end and eventually became the head of what would become the West German Intelligence Service, the BND. The deal Gehlen negotiated gave him considerable autonomy in how he ran his operations, and it resulted in the integration of a significant number of former Nazi intelligence and SS personnel into a network that was now working for the United States and eventually West Germany. The details of this arrangement were classified for decades. When documents relating to it were eventually released, they showed that American officials had been aware that they were working with individuals who had participated in war crimes, and that the calculation made was that the intelligence value of these individuals outweighed the moral and legal problems their recruitment created. The same calculation was applied in a different context by American officials dealing with Japanese military intelligence after the war. Yoshio Kodama, a Japanese ultra-nationalist who had operated as a procurement agent for the Japanese Navy during the war and had accumulated a significant fortune through looting and black market operations in occupied China, was recruited by American intelligence after the war and used as an asset in the effort to build a stable, anti-communist political structure in Japan. His wartime activities and the fortune he had accumulated through them were documented in American intelligence files. He was released from Sugamo prison, where he had been held as a Class A war crimes suspect without being charged, and he went on to play a significant role in Japanese politics for the next 2 decades. The CIA's relationship with him was not formally acknowledged for many years. The fate of what has been called Nazi gold, the gold and other valuables looted from Jewish victims of the Holocaust and deposited in the banking systems of neutral countries, is another area where the documentary record tells a story that diverges considerably from the post-war narrative of accountability. Switzerland, which maintained its neutrality throughout the war, served as the primary clearinghouse for German financial transactions in the international economy. Swiss banks accepted gold deposits from the German Reichsbank throughout the war, and a significant portion of this gold had been looted from Holocaust victims, including gold removed from individuals before their murder and gold recovered from the bodies of victims after death. The Swiss banking system processed these transactions using the same protocols it applied to any other financial transaction. After the war, the Swiss government and banking industry negotiated a settlement with the Allied powers that involved a one-time payment of 250 million Swiss francs and an agreement that Switzerland's wartime financial activities would not be subject to further investigation. Documents relating to the specific origin of the gold that passed through Swiss banks were sealed. An American congressional commission that investigated this history in the 1990s found that the settlement had been far less comprehensive than had been claimed, and that dormant accounts belonging to Holocaust victims had been quietly absorbed by Swiss banks for decades. Portugal and Spain, 2 other neutral countries, also served as conduits for German economic activity during the war, and the history of their wartime economic relationships with Germany has been examined only partially. Francisco Franco's Spain received significant economic benefits from Germany in exchange for Spanish participation in the conflict on the Eastern Front through the Blue Division, and for continued Spanish provision of tungsten, which was a critical material for German weapons production. The negotiations around Spanish tungsten deliveries were the subject of extensive diplomatic activity by both Allied and Axis powers, and the record of these negotiations is detailed and preserved. What is less preserved is the record of financial transactions that accompanied these relationships, much of which passed through informal channels and was never fully documented. The experience of colonial subjects during World War II represents one of the most thoroughly marginalized dimensions of the conflict's history. India, which was under British colonial rule, contributed approximately 2.5 million soldiers to the Allied war effort, the largest volunteer army in history, according to official British records. What those same records also document, though this dimension receives far less attention, is the Bengal famine of 1943, in which approximately 2 to 3 million people in the Indian province of Bengal died of starvation and related causes. The famine occurred during the war and was shaped by wartime policy decisions. Wartime price controls, the prioritization of food exports for military use, the destruction of boats along the Bengal coast as a precaution against Japanese invasion, and the British government's decisions about which populations would receive food aid were all factors that shaped the scale of the disaster. Internal British government communications from the period show that officials in London and in the Indian colonial administration were aware of the scale of the mortality, and that requests for additional food imports were denied or delayed. Winston Churchill's personal views on the famine, expressed in private communications that have since become available, were not characterized by urgency about preventing civilian death. The famine was not the subject of any accountability process after the war. It was categorized as a wartime emergency, documented in administrative records, and then filed. The use of chemical weapons in the Second World War is another area where the documentary record contains material that complicates the conventional narrative. Germany, despite having developed and produced large quantities of nerve agents including tabun, sarin and soman, did not deploy these weapons on the battlefield during the war. The reasons for this restraint have been debated by historians, and the available evidence suggests that Hitler's personal experience of gas attacks during World War I, combined with uncertainty about Allied retaliatory capacity, contributed to the decision not to use them. What is documented, and less frequently discussed, is that the Allied powers also possessed large chemical weapons stockpiles and had active programs for their potential deployment. American forces brought chemical weapons to European theaters that were never used, but that were present in significant quantities. A German bombing raid on the port of Bari, Italy in December 1943 sank an American cargo ship, the John Harvey, that was carrying mustard gas bombs as part of a secret stockpile. The release of mustard gas from the sinking ship affected Allied personnel in the harbor and killed an unknown number of Italian civilians. The American government initially concealed the nature of the casualties, and medical personnel treating victims were not informed that they were dealing with mustard gas exposure, which affected the treatment these individuals received. A complete accounting of the Bari incident was classified and not made fully public until well after the war. British use of chemical weapons during the interwar period and in colonial contexts had established precedents that shaped the thinking of British military planners during World War II. Winston Churchill had advocated in 1919 for the use of chemical weapons against what he described as uncivilized tribes in the context of colonial operations in Mesopotamia, and had expressed relatively few moral reservations about chemical weapons use in contexts where British forces had clear military superiority. During World War II, Churchill advocated at multiple points for chemical weapons use against Germany if Germany initiated chemical attacks, and internal British planning documents show that retaliatory options were kept available throughout the war. The American military in the Pacific Theater considered the use of chemical weapons against Japanese positions, and planning documents relating to these deliberations have been declassified and examined by historians. The weapons were not used, but the planning process and the frameworks within which these decisions were being made are documented in considerable detail. The medical experiments conducted on human subjects during World War II extended beyond the well-documented programs of Unit 731 and the Nazi concentration camp system. American military and intelligence agencies conducted classified experiments during and after the war that involved human subjects who did not or could not give meaningful consent. The testing of mustard gas on American soldiers, including a significant number of African American and Puerto Rican soldiers who were used as test subjects in racially segregated experimental programs, was conducted by the Army Chemical Warfare Service and documented in military records that were classified after the war. Veterans who participated in these experiments were not told what they had been exposed to, were instructed not to discuss their participation, and in many cases received no medical follow-up or treatment for the conditions that resulted from their exposure. When they sought treatment at Veterans Administration facilities for conditions related to their exposure, they frequently encountered denials of service connection because their records had been classified and the VA's medical personnel had no documentation of what these men had experienced. The story of the mustard gas experiments on American service members is one specific instance of a broader pattern in which American military personnel were used as research subjects during and after World War II in ways that involved inadequate or absent consent processes. The declassified record of the Atomic Veterans Program, which involved the deliberate exposure of American military personnel to nuclear weapons tests in the post-war years, includes documentation showing that military officials were aware that the purpose of positioning troops near nuclear blasts was partly to study the physiological and psychological effects of nuclear weapons exposure on soldiers. The research value of this data was built into the planning documents. The soldiers who participated in these tests were also instructed not to discuss their experience and in many cases received no medical monitoring or follow-up. The legal process through which some of these veterans eventually received recognition of their service-related conditions took decades and was incomplete when many of them died. The conduct of the war in the Pacific Theater involved a number of practices and policies that were documented in military records and that have received less systematic attention than the European theater. The no-quarter fighting that characterized certain engagements in the Pacific, meaning combat in which prisoners were not taken, was documented by American military personnel in letters, diaries, and after-action reports. The collection of body parts from Japanese soldiers as trophies, including skulls and teeth, was widespread enough that it was noted in official military communications and in reporting by journalists embedded with American forces. Life magazine published a photograph in 1944 showing a young American woman examining a Japanese skull that her boyfriend had sent her from the Pacific, with a caption that treated this as a human interest story. The photograph appeared without apparent editorial concern about whether it depicted a war crime. Military regulations technically prohibited the collection of such trophies, but the documentary record shows that enforcement was essentially non-existent. The treatment of Japanese prisoners of war by American forces varied considerably depending on location and command, but the overall record shows a mortality rate for Japanese prisoners in American custody that was significantly higher than the rate for German and Italian prisoners held by the same forces. Multiple factors contributed to this disparity, including the fact that Japanese military personnel were socialized to regard surrender as deeply dishonorable and therefore frequently chose death over capture, and including the fact that the logistics of prisoner handling in the Pacific Theater were genuinely more difficult than in Europe. But the record also shows that the prevailing attitudes toward Japanese soldiers among American forces, attitudes shaped by wartime propaganda that consistently portrayed Japanese soldiers as subhuman, affected how individual American soldiers treated prisoners and wounded enemy soldiers. These attitudes and their consequences are documented in official after-action reports, in declassified intelligence assessments, and in the private correspondence of American service members, some of which has been preserved in archives and examined by historians. The role of propaganda in shaping both the conduct of the war and the historical memory of it is difficult to overstate, and it operated through institutional channels that were carefully managed by every major power. American wartime propaganda was produced and distributed through a formal government apparatus, the Office of War Information, and it was coordinated with the military censorship system, which controlled what journalists could report from combat zones. The censorship regime was not merely about preventing the disclosure of operationally sensitive information, though that was its stated purpose. It also shaped the emotional character of how the war was presented to the American public. Images of American dead were initially prohibited from publication entirely. A policy change in 1943 allowed limited publication of such images as a calculated decision to counteract what military and government officials perceived as excessive civilian complacency about the human cost of the war. But the selection of images for release was carefully managed. Images that showed the reality of combat in ways that might generate anti-war sentiment rather than steeled resolve were held back. This selection process was documented in internal OE memoranda and in the records of the military censorship apparatus. The Soviet Union's wartime propaganda was managed with comparable attention to detail and considerably less tolerance for any deviation from approved narratives. Soviet reporting on the war operated under an information regime so tight that even the scale of Soviet military losses so vast that their true magnitude was not officially acknowledged by the Russian government until decades after the war, was effectively suppressed during the conflict itself. The official Soviet death toll during the war was consistently understated, and the circumstances of many Soviet military defeats during the early years of the war were entirely suppressed. The Katyn massacre, in which approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals were executed by the Soviet NKVD in 1940, was attributed to Germany by the Soviet Union throughout the war and for decades afterward. The Soviet denial of responsibility for Katyn was maintained even as documentary evidence mounted, and the Soviet government's position was one that Allied governments found it diplomatically convenient not to challenge aggressively during the war years, because the Soviet Union's participation in the war against Germany was considered essential to Allied victory. The true circumstances of Katyn were not officially acknowledged by the Soviet government until 1990. The management of racial categories during World War II extended across all the major combatant nations in ways that shaped military organization, resource allocation, and the treatment of civilian populations. In the United States, the armed forces were racially segregated until 1948. And this segregation was reflected in every dimension of military life, from the assignment of combat roles to the allocation of recreational facilities. African American soldiers who served in segregated units frequently encountered discrimination not only within the American military structure, but also in interactions with white American soldiers and officers in ways that are documented in official complaints, congressional testimony, and the personal records of the soldiers themselves. The 761st Tank Battalion, which was the first African-American tank unit to see combat in World War II, trained for years before being committed to combat, and the delay was attributable at least in part to resistance from white commanders who questioned the combat capability of African-American soldiers, despite having no operational evidence on which to base this judgment. When the 761st finally saw combat in France in 1944, it performed at a level that earned it a Presidential Unit Citation, though that citation was not formally awarded until 1978. German military racial ideology was constructed with a precision that distinguished it from the broader pattern of racial discrimination common across the major powers, because it was built into formal legal and administrative frameworks in ways that had direct operational consequences. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 had established legal categories of racial identity that were then applied throughout the war in determining who was subject to which policies and protections. The extension of these categories into occupied territories required the creation of local administrative structures that could process racial determinations for large populations quickly and with acceptable consistency from the German administrative perspective. In countries like the Netherlands and France, existing administrative infrastructure, census records, municipal registration systems, police forces, was adapted to serve the purposes of racial categorization and identification. Local officials who cooperated with these processes were, in most cases, operating within the legal frameworks that existed in their countries under occupation, and the degree of voluntary cooperation versus coerced compliance varied considerably both across countries and within them. The documentary record of local administrative cooperation with German racial policies is extensive in some countries and sparse in others, and the political sensitivity of this record has shaped the degree to which it has been openly examined in different national contexts. The systematic looting of cultural property and personal assets by German forces throughout occupied Europe was an operation with its own bureaucratic infrastructure. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which was the formal German agency responsible for the seizure of cultural property, maintained detailed inventories of what it confiscated. These inventories documented the origin of seized items, their estimated value, and their intended destination, which was primarily the private collections of Nazi leadership or designated storage facilities in Germany. The looting of Jewish assets was similarly documented. The Reichsbank received deposits of looted gold and foreign currency, maintained accounts for these deposits, and processed them into the German financial system. The administrative records of the looting process are among the more complete records produced by the Nazi state, because the process was conceived as an organized economic operation rather than as mere theft, and economic operations required documentation. The post-war restitution process, which has continued in various forms into the 21st century, has been able to proceed in part because these records survived and because they are detailed enough to trace the ownership chain of specific items. The experience of occupied populations in both the European and Pacific theaters was shaped by a set of policies and practices that produced civilian suffering on an enormous scale. And the documentation of this suffering in military and administrative records is extensive in ways that have only gradually become accessible. In the Philippines, Japanese occupation policies, including the use of forced civilian labor, the systematic extraction of agricultural resources, and the conduct of military operations in urban areas, killed an estimated 100,000 to 500,000 Filipino civilians, with the higher estimates reflecting deaths during the final Japanese defense of Manila in early 1945, during which Japanese forces massacred large numbers of Filipino civilians in actions that are documented in contemporary American military intelligence reports and in the records of subsequent war crimes trials. In Vietnam, Japanese seizure of rice stocks during the occupation, combined with a policy of maintaining transportation infrastructure for military use rather than food distribution, contributed to a famine in 1944 and 1945 that killed approximately 1 to 2 million Vietnamese civilians. This famine and its causes were documented in French colonial administrative records, in Japanese military logistics records, and in reports prepared by American intelligence officers operating in the region. The famine has received relatively little attention in histories of the war focused on the European theater or on the American Pacific Campaign. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki require discussion not because they are unknown, but because the specific nature of the decision-making process that produced them is documented in detail that the conventional summary of the decision rarely conveys. The decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan was made through a formal institutional process involving the Target Committee, the Interim Committee, and ultimately the President, with input from military, scientific, and political advisors. The records of these deliberations, which are available in declassified form, show that the decision was not as simple as the choice between using the bomb and conducting a land invasion of Japan. The deliberations included consideration of the use of the bomb on uninhabited territory as a demonstration intended to compel Japanese surrender without direct use against a populated area. This option was considered and rejected on grounds that are documented in the meeting records. The reasoning included the possibility that a demonstration might not be sufficiently impressive, the possibility that the bomb might fail without producing a military response, and the assessment that the direct use of the bomb against a target with military significance and a large population would produce the maximum psychological impact on Japanese leadership. The selection of specific target cities involved a process managed by the Target Committee that considered factors including the size and character of the target, the likelihood of achieving maximum damage, and the value of preserving certain targets from conventional bombing so that the damage caused by the atomic weapon could be accurately assessed. The city of Kyoto was initially on the target list and was removed by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, in part because of Stimson's personal knowledge of and appreciation for the city's cultural significance. This removal was not based on any assessment of the military necessity of the target or the proportionality of its destruction. It was a personal preference exercised by a senior official within an administrative process that otherwise followed its own logic to the outcomes documented in history. The decision about whether Japan would have surrendered without the atomic bombings has been argued by historians for decades, and the documentation on both sides of the question is substantial. What is clearly documented is that the Japanese government was engaged in back-channel diplomatic communication through Soviet intermediaries in the months before the bombings, attempting to explore the conditions under which a negotiated peace might be possible, and that American signals intelligence was reading at least some of this communication. The Japanese government's central condition for surrender was the preservation of the imperial system, the retention of the emperor. The final terms of Japanese surrender, as accepted by the Allied powers after the atomic bombings, included provisions that effectively preserved the imperial system in the form of the emperor remaining on the throne in a constitutional role. This outcome, the very condition that Japanese diplomatic communication had been probing for months, was achieved after the atomic bombings. Whether it could have been achieved before the bombings through a modification of unconditional surrender terms is a question the historical record cannot answer definitively. What the record does show is that the question was discussed by American officials before the bombings, that some advisors advocated for modifying the surrender terms specifically to address the status of the emperor, and that this advice was not followed. The institutional momentum behind the use of the bomb, the enormous financial and organizational investment in its development, and the political context of an American public and military that expected Japan to be forced into unconditional surrender, all contributed to a decision-making environment in which the path of least institutional resistance was to use the weapon that had been built. The handling of Japanese-American property during the internment period provides a specific example of how the machinery of the American government processed a legally authorized injustice in ways that are detailed in the documentary record. The Alien Property Custodian, which was a government office with authority over the property of enemy aliens, maintained detailed records of property that came under its jurisdiction. The evacuation orders that removed Japanese Americans from the West Coast gave families days, or in some cases hours, to dispose of their property. The documentary record of what happened to this property includes accounts from the people who were forced to sell it, records from the government offices that had oversight of the evacuation, and records from local governments and businesses that participated in or observed the process. Farm equipment, crops in the field, businesses and real property were sold at prices that reflected not market value, but the compelled and immediate nature of the sale. Banks foreclosed on properties whose owners could not make mortgage payments from inside internment camps. Insurance policies lapsed. Businesses were dissolved. When the internment ended and families returned to the communities they had left, they returned to a materially different situation than the one they had left, and the legal and administrative mechanisms for addressing this loss were inadequate and slow. The experience of German prisoners of war held by American forces raises questions that the conventional narrative of American POW treatment rarely addresses directly. The Geneva Convention standards for POW treatment were generally followed by American forces in Europe, and conditions in American POW camps in the United States for German and Italian prisoners were by most accounts considerably more comfortable than conditions in Soviet or German camps. But there is a documented period at the end of the war and immediately after Germany's surrender, during which the treatment of German prisoners in American custody deteriorated significantly. The reconstitution of prisoner categories following Germany's surrender involved the reclassification of many Germans who had previously been classified as prisoners of war into a new category: disarmed enemy forces, or DEF, which had no clear protection under the Geneva Convention because a prisoner of war by definition belonged to a power that was still at war, and Germany had unconditionally surrendered. The practical consequence of this reclassification was that a large number of German soldiers, some estimates placing the number in the hundreds of thousands, were held in open-air enclosures without adequate food, shelter, or medical care in the immediate post-war period. The death rate among these enclosures, which included the Rhine Meadows camps in western Germany, has been a subject of historical dispute, with estimates ranging from several thousand to several 100,000 deaths. The American military's own records from this period are incomplete, which is itself notable given the precision with which American military record-keeping ordinarily functioned. James Back, a Canadian author who published a study of this period in 1989, produced estimates of German prisoner deaths in American and French custody that were disputed by professional historians, and the professional response to his work reflected both legitimate methodological criticisms and a degree of institutional resistance to examining American conduct during this period with the same scrutiny applied to the conduct of other powers. French colonial troops who served in the Allied liberation of Western Europe brought with them a pattern of conduct toward German and Italian civilians that was documented in contemporary Allied military records and in the complaints of local authorities in Italy and Germany. The French Expeditionary Corps, which included a significant number of Moroccan and Algerian soldiers, was accused of widespread rape and looting in Italian villages following the breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944. These accusations were sufficiently documented that they were communicated up the Allied command chain, and some prosecutions of individual soldiers took place within the French military justice system. The broader phenomenon, which was documented in reports from Italian civil and ecclesiastical authorities and in communications among Allied commanders, was treated as a disciplinary problem manageable through command authority rather than as something requiring systematic accountability. The Italian government after the war pressed France for recognition of these events through diplomatic channels, with limited success. The historical examination of these events in France has been uneven, and the documentation, while available in archives, has received less academic attention than parallel events in other parts of the war. The Soviet conduct during the final advance into Germany in 1945 was characterized by a level of violence against the German civilian population that is extensively documented in both Soviet and German sources, and that was known to Allied commanders during the war. The scale of rape committed by Soviet forces in Germany has been estimated by historians, based on examination of medical records, hospital documentation, and population surveys, at somewhere between 300,000 and 2 million women, with estimates varying depending on methodology and geographic scope. The Soviet military command was aware of this conduct. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded Soviet forces in Germany, issued orders attempting to limit the violence, and these orders are in the Soviet military record. They had limited effect. The violence was so widespread and occurred with such regularity that it cannot be attributed to isolated individual acts. It reflected a permissive environment created by the combination of ideological dehumanization of the German population, the accumulated trauma and rage of Soviet soldiers who had lost family members to German occupation, the collapse of discipline that tends to accompany rapid military advance, and a command culture that prioritized military outcomes over the welfare of civilians who were categorized as the enemy population. These factors do not assign individual culpability in a way that maps neatly onto the legal frameworks established at Nuremberg. They do describe a reality that was documented, observed, and processed into military records that existed within the same institutional system that was simultaneously producing the legal framework of post-war accountability. The history of biological weapons development during World War II extended beyond Unit 731 to include active programs in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the Soviet Union. The American program, which was centered at Fort Detrick in Maryland, developed and produced biological agents including anthrax, botulinum toxin, and other pathogens during the war, and these materials were stockpiled for potential retaliatory use. The British program was sufficiently advanced that it conducted open-air tests of anthrax bombs on Grenade Island, a small island off the Scottish coast, in 1942, and the island remained contaminated with viable anthrax spores for the next 40 years. The deliberate decision to test a weapon of this kind in an open environment, a decision made by scientists and military officials operating within a formal institutional structure, produced a contamination that outlasted the war by 4 decades and required a significant decontamination effort in the 1980s. The testing records from Grenade are available in British National Archives, and they document a methodical experimental program that included measurements of spore dispersal, animal exposure assessments, and efficiency calculations for the weapon that was being developed. The Soviet biological weapons program was the largest of any nation during the war, and continued expanding after the war ended, ultimately becoming the biopreparat program, which employed tens of thousands of scientists and produced weaponized pathogens at an industrial scale well into the 1980s and 1990s. The full scope of Soviet biological weapons activities during World War II and after is still not completely known, partly because Russian archives relating to this program remain restricted. What is known comes primarily from Soviet defectors, the most significant of whom was Ken Alibek, a former biopreparat official who provided detailed accounts of the program after his defection in 1992. The existence and scale of the Soviet program was known to American intelligence services before Alibek's defection, but the political and diplomatic context of Cold War relations, the difficulty of verification in the absence of on-site access, and the management of arms control negotiations all created pressures that shaped how aggressively the United States pursued accountability for Soviet biological weapons activities. The history of the war's financing and the mechanisms through which governments sustained the economic demands of total war contains details that rarely appear in narrative histories of the conflict. The American Lend-Lease program, which provided war materials to allied nations including the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, was structured in ways that involved complex financial arrangements and political negotiations that are documented in the diplomatic and treasury records of the period. Britain's Lend-Lease debt was only formally settled in 2006, when the United Kingdom made its final payment on a post-war loan arrangement that had been deeply resented by British officials who viewed it as exploiting British wartime desperation. The Soviet Union's Lend-Lease debt, which was never fully settled, became a recurring point of diplomatic friction in the early Cold War years. The financial arrangements surrounding Lend-Lease are documented in records at the National Archives and at the British National Archives, and they reveal a wartime relationship between Britain and the United States that was considerably more transactional than the conventional image of the special relationship suggests. The treatment of occupied populations in terms of food supply and resource extraction was a defining feature of German occupation policy, and it was executed through a formal administrative apparatus that maintained detailed records. The Hunger Plan, which was the German plan for the occupation of the Soviet Union, explicitly projected that tens of millions of Soviet citizens would die of starvation as a consequence of German resource extraction policies. And this projection was made in a planning document dated before the German invasion began. The document, which was produced by the Reich Ministry for Food and Agriculture in collaboration with military planning offices, described the diversion of Soviet agricultural production from local consumption to German military and domestic use as an explicit policy objective, with the resulting civilian starvation characterized as an unavoidable but acceptable consequence. This document exists. It is in the German Federal Archives. It was produced by officials who then implemented the policies it described, and the deaths that followed, in the millions, affecting both Soviet civilians and Soviet prisoners of war, were the predictable and predicted consequence of institutional decisions made in the ordinary course of wartime administrative planning. The question of how knowledge of atrocities was managed within the Allied powers during the war is one that the documentary record addresses with considerable specificity. The British government received information about the mass murder of Jews through multiple channels beginning in 1942, including diplomatic communications, reports from resistance networks, and signals intelligence derived from the decryption of German police and SS communications. The American government received similar information through its own channels. The decision about how to respond to this information, whether to publicize it, whether to bomb the rail lines leading to the extermination camps, whether to include specific reference to the genocide of Jews in Allied war aims, was made through a deliberate institutional process. The decision not to bomb Auschwitz and the rail lines leading to it was made in 1944, when Auschwitz was within range of Allied aircraft that were conducting regular bombing missions in the region. The reasons given for not bombing included the assessment that the bombing would require diversion of resources from strategic targets, and that the accuracy of strategic bombing at that point in the war could not guarantee effective targeting of the rail lines without significant risk to the prisoners in the camps. These assessments were made and recorded in memoranda that are available in declassified form. There were individuals within both the American and British governments who argued that the bombing should proceed regardless of these assessments, and their arguments and the institutional responses to those arguments are also in the record. The war in the Pacific involved a set of decisions about the treatment of island populations, both Japanese-occupied and American-occupied, that produced a significant amount of documentation and that has been examined unevenly. The fighting on islands like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa was characterized by a level of tactical brutality on both sides that is well documented in official military records and in the personal accounts of participants. The Battle of Okinawa, which involved significant civilian casualties, produced a specific historical controversy because a significant number of Okinawan civilians died in circumstances that included both Japanese military actions. Japanese commanders ordered or encouraged civilian suicide in some areas of the island, and American military fire. The precise breakdown of how Okinawan civilians died during the battle is a matter of historical examination that has been shaped by the political context of post-war Okinawa's relationship with both Japan and the United States, and the records from which this examination must proceed are distributed across American military archives, Japanese military and civilian archives, and the oral histories collected from surviving Okinawans. The post-war economic order that emerged from the war was shaped by decisions made during the war itself, and the institutional continuities between wartime economic management and post-war economic organization are visible in the documentary record. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, which established the international monetary framework that governed the post-war global economy, was organized by the American Treasury Department, and the Treasury official most responsible for its design, Harry Dexter White, was simultaneously, as subsequent investigations revealed, in contact with Soviet intelligence. This does not mean that the Bretton Woods system was a Soviet operation. White's motivations and the degree of his actual cooperation with Soviet intelligence are matters of historical dispute. It does mean that the design of the post-war international economic architecture was conducted in an environment where the institutional boundaries between national governments and foreign intelligence services were permeable in ways that were not publicly acknowledged at the time and that only became partially known through subsequent investigations. The purging of war crimes records after the war took place in multiple contexts and through multiple mechanisms. German officials who anticipated defeat destroyed records in the final months of the war, and the degree of success in these destruction efforts varied considerably. The Nuremberg prosecution teams found enormous quantities of surviving documentation precisely because the German bureaucratic culture had been so thorough in its record-keeping during the war, and because the rapid collapse of the German military position had prevented complete destruction of the archive. But the records that were destroyed are, by definition, not available to examine, and the significance of what was destroyed can only be estimated by the gaps in the surviving record. Japanese destruction of records at the end of the war was more thorough in some respects, particularly regarding the activities of Unit 731 and the systematic documentation of war crimes in the Pacific Theater. The decision by Japanese military and government officials to order the destruction of records was made at the institutional level in the days and weeks following the announcement of Japan's surrender, and the record of this destruction order is itself documented in the surviving records. The process by which the historical memory of the war was constructed in the decades following the armistice was itself an institutional operation conducted by governments, educational systems, memorial organizations, and publishing industries, all of which made decisions about what to emphasize, what to minimize, what to commemorate, and what to make the official narrative. In Japan, the post-war educational curriculum's treatment of the country's wartime conduct was shaped by a political contest between those who wanted fuller acknowledgement of Japanese military atrocities and those who wanted to frame the war as a defensive response to Western imperialism and a tragic national experience rather than as an aggressive imperial project. This contest is ongoing. In Germany, the post-war project of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the working through of the past, involved a sustained and serious engagement with German wartime conduct that was more thorough than in most other countries, but it also involved selective emphases and institutional processes for managing this engagement that shaped what was confronted and what was bracketed. In the United States, the construction of the greatest generation narrative in the post-war decades involved a framing of American military service that emphasized sacrifice and heroism in ways that were not fully compatible with the documentary record of American conduct in the Pacific Theater, or with the racial hierarchies that had organized American military service throughout the war. The construction of war memorials is itself a form of institutional document, and the decisions made about what to memorialize and how reveal the priorities of the institutional processes that produce them. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, which broke with the tradition of triumphal war monuments by listing the names of the dead without any statement about the cause for which they died, was controversial when it was proposed and controversial when it was built, because its aesthetic choices could be read as a refusal to make the institutional claim that the deaths it documented had been purposeful and just. The World War II memorial on the National Mall, which was built decades later, was more conventionally triumphal in its design, organizing the war around the theme of national purpose achieved, which is one possible reading of the historical record, and not the only one. Neither memorial is wrong. Both are institutional choices about what to select from the record and how to organize its presentation, made by committees using formal processes, documented in minutes and correspondence that are themselves part of the record. The veterans of World War II who returned to their home countries carried experiences that the institutional mechanisms of post-war society were not entirely prepared to process. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist during or after World War II. The clinical recognition of combat-related psychological trauma under that name came much later, following the Vietnam War and the advocacy of Vietnam veterans and mental health professionals. But the phenomena that the term describes were present in World War II veterans, documented in military medical records under earlier diagnostic categories, and in the accounts of family members and medical professionals who worked with returning veterans. The American military's own medical records from the late 1940s and 1950s contain extensive documentation of psychiatric disability among veterans, of alcohol dependence, of domestic violence, and of the difficulty veterans experienced in returning to civilian employment and social life. These records existed within military and Veterans Administration bureaucratic systems that were not organized to provide the kind of sustained psychological care that many veterans needed, and the gap between the documented need and the institutional response is itself a feature of the documentary record. The generation of German and Japanese civilians who lived through the final phases of the war in their home countries experienced a set of events that the post-war institutional order processed in specific ways. German civilians who were displaced by the advance of Soviet forces or who fled westward to avoid Soviet occupation constituted one of the largest forced population movements in European history. Somewhere between 12 and 14 million Germans were expelled from Eastern European territories after the war, under conditions that included significant mortality from cold, starvation, violence, and disease. This population movement was authorized by the Potsdam Agreement, signed by the Allied powers, which specified that the transfer of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary should be carried out in an orderly and humane manner. The records of what actually occurred during these expulsions, which are available in both German and Polish and Czech archives, document a reality that differed considerably from the orderly and humane transfer specified in the official agreement. The death toll from the expulsions has been estimated by the German Federal Archive as ranging from approximately 400,000 to 600,000 people, with some estimates running higher. And these deaths were the consequence of conditions that are documented in contemporary reports from Allied military observers, Red Cross representatives, and other sources that were present in the expulsion zones. The infrastructure of post-war accountability was built on an uneven foundation, and the unevenness was a feature of the political choices made by the powers that constructed it. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg prosecuted the surviving senior leadership of the Nazi state. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, which were conducted by American military authorities, prosecuted a wider range of perpetrators, including military commanders, doctors, lawyers, and industrialists. These trials produced significant judicial records and established legal precedents that contributed to the development of international humanitarian law. But the selection of defendants for these trials, the charges brought, and the sentences imposed were all the product of institutional processes operating in a specific political environment, and the full consequences of what had occurred during the war were not and could not be encompassed within any judicial framework applied to a selection of individuals. The lawyers and judges and legal theorists who worked within the Nuremberg framework were doing something genuinely significant. They were also working within an institutional system that had specific limitations, and some of those limitations were the direct result of political decisions made by the governments conducting the prosecutions. The subsequent Nuremberg trials produced the Doctors' Trial, which prosecuted 23 German physicians and scientists for medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The trial produced the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles establishing conditions for ethical medical research that has been enormously influential in the development of research ethics standards globally. One of the central provisions of the Nuremberg Code is that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This principle was articulated in direct response to the documented conduct of German physicians who had conducted experiments on prisoners who had no capacity for meaningful consent. In the same period that the Nuremberg Code was being established, American military and intelligence agencies were conducting research on human subjects that did not comply with its requirements, including the mustard gas experiments on segregated troops described earlier and the early stages of what would become the CIA's MKUltra program of psychological research using unwitting subjects. The Nuremberg Code was established as a standard for medical ethics by American prosecutors who were simultaneously overseeing programs that did not comply with it. This is documented. The question of whether any of the 17 distinct realities described across this narration constitute buried information in the conventional sense, information that was actively suppressed, is a question the documentary record answers in complicated ways. Some of this information was actively classified and withheld from the public for years or decades. Some of it was publicly available but simply not incorporated into the dominant historical narrative, because the institutions that construct historical narratives had reasons to emphasize other aspects of the record. Some of it was known at the time and reported accurately by journalists and officials who were then ignored or marginalized. The mechanisms by which information becomes central to a historical narrative and the mechanisms by which it remains peripheral are institutional processes, and they operate with the same methodical efficiency that characterize the administrative systems that produce the events themselves. The filing cabinets in which these records sit are made of the same steel as every other filing cabinet. The papers in them are marked with the same ink. The signatures at the bottom of the pages belong to men who went home in the evening and ate dinner with their families and did not, in the ordinary moments of their lives, experience themselves as participants in events outside the range of normal human behavior. The war ended in 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Germany in May and Japan in September. The armies demobilized. The bureaucracies that had managed the violence were restructured or disbanded or absorbed into the peacetime administrative apparatus. The records were filed. The institutions continued.